At 1:37 p.m. on June 20th, 1944, 20,000 feet above the industrial inferno of Luna, Germany, the sound was not the clean, deafening roar of four Wright Cyclone engines. It was the horrific metallic scream of an engine chewing itself to pieces. Sergeant Maynard McDowell, chief engineer and top turret gunner of the B-17G, named the Valkyrie was pressed against the radio compartment wall, his body rigid against the shuddering airframe. Below him, the ground was a patchwork of gray smoke and defensive flak bursts, blooming like deadly black carnations. But the external enemy was secondary. The enemy was in the starboard wing. Engine number 3 had suffered a catastrophic runaway propeller. The blades were tearing at the thin, frigid air with uncontrolled fury, threatening to rip the entire power plant from its nacelle. The vibrating torque was so intense that the heavy machine guns in Mac's turret were rattling loose from their mounts. The Valkyrie was being shaken apart, 200 miles deep inside enemy territory, flying at a critical 158 miles per hour, barely above stall speed for a fully loaded flying fortress. The inside temperature of the B-17 at this altitude was hovering near minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, but sweat was dripping from the brows of the pilot, Lieutenant Alistair Vance, and his co-pilot. Vance gripped the yoke, fighting the torque that was trying to roll the 65,000-pound bomber onto its side. "Mac, you hear that? It sounds like a freight train coming through the cockpit." Vance yelled over the intercom, his voice distorted by panic and static. "Affirmative, Lieutenant. The prop is running away." "We are getting zero feather response, sir." "She's shaking the wings clean off." Mac reported, his voice surprisingly steady, despite the way the floor plates were flexing beneath his boots. A runaway prop was one of the most terrifying failures a B-17 crew could face. The propellers were designed to feather, turn the blades parallel to the airflow when an engine died, minimizing drag. When feathering failed, the engine, disconnected from the powertrain, would spin faster and faster, generating violent vibration, massive drag, and potential wing failure. It was the mechanical equivalent of a death sentence, almost always forcing the crew to bail out. But bailing out over Luna meant parachuting straight into the heart of the German anti-aircraft defenses, usually resulting in capture or immediate execution. McDowell wasn't willing to jump, not yet. Mac was not the typical chief engineer found in the pristine manuals handed out by Boeing. He was a product of the 486th Bomb Group, a unit based in Sudbury, England, known less for parade ground perfection and more for its almost fanatical commitment to improvisation and mechanical heresy. Mac was 24 years old, 6 feet tall, and looked permanently covered in hydraulic fluid and defiance. In the rigid structure of the 8th Air Force, Mac was an anomaly. He joined the Army Air Corps after a string of minor, technically impressive thefts back home in Detroit, mostly involving highly modified hot rods and bypassing complex security systems. The Army saw a disciplinary problem. His first commanding officer, Captain Eli Vance, Lieutenant Vance's older brother, now deceased, saw a mechanic who understood how to make a machine do what it was not designed to do. Mac's specialty was survival engineering. He had custom-rigged heating coils using stolen components from decommissioned Spitfires to keep the Norden bombsight electronics warm. He had fabricated a non-standard pressure gauge for the hydraulic system using parts from a captured Messerschmitt. He didn't follow procedure. He wrote his own, usually smeared in engine grease, on the back of a cigarette pack. When Mac had first joined the Valkyrie crew, he'd spent 3 weeks reinforcing key structural points with additional, non-standard stress plates metal he'd literally salvaged from wrecked bombers in the scrapyard. The joke in the 486th was that if you gave Mac a bent paperclip and a piece of chewing gum, he could fix a fuel leak at 30,000 feet. Now, he was facing the ultimate test of his unorthodox genius. Vance's voice cracked over the intercom again. "Mac, we're dropping 500 feet per minute. We're falling out of the combat box. The fighters are going to be on us in seconds. What is the status of number 3? The massive formation of 200 B-17s was rapidly pulling ahead. The Valkyrie was bleeding speed, becoming a slow, isolated target for the swift Focke-Wulfs 190s waiting below the cloud deck. Mac knew the standard procedure. Attempt feathering 3 times. If that fails, cut the fuel and ignition, and brace for the wing to fail or jump. He ignored the manual. "Lieutenant, I'm heading back to the radio compartment. I need to get eyes on the engine, visually. I think the prop governor linkage is destroyed. I might be able to manually seize the prop, but I need access to the wing route. This is going to be unconventional." Mac ripped off his heavy sheepskin gloves. The only way to stop that spinning prop was to get to the accessory section of the engine A, section usually unreachable in flight, especially under heavy enemy fire. He saw a dilemma forming dark and immediate. Try a repair that was impossible according to every maintenance guideline, risking falling out of the plane and guaranteed death, or stay in the cockpit and guarantee the plane's destruction in minutes. The B-17 suddenly jolted violently as a nearby shell burst. Mac slammed his helmet against a metal rib. He could smell the acrid cordite, even inside the pressurized fuselage. The nose gunner screamed something inaudible. Mac grabbed a wrench and a short, heavy length of chain used for securing cargo, relics of his survival kit. He had 2 minutes before they were completely alone. He had less than 30 seconds before the vibration became structural failure. "I'm going out there, Lieutenant," Mac finally said, pulling open the access door to the belly section. "Tell the waist gunners to cover me if I need to move into the catwalk. And pray I don't get sucked out at 20,000 feet. The clock on the radio operator's desk read 1:39 p.m. when Sergeant McDowell pulled open the blast door separating the cockpit area from the radio compartment. He was instantly assaulted by a freezing, violent gale. The radio room was the epicenter of the vibration, a relentless 30-cycle-per-second shudder that threatened to loosen teeth. Mac moved past the radio operator, Sergeant Dale Harris, who was desperately trying to send a mayday signal that the static was consuming. Harris simply nodded, his eyes wide and haunted. The air was thin, the oxygen masks were mandatory, but Mac had pulled his down around his neck, needing the clarity of direct breath for the precise work ahead. The raw cold immediately began to sear his exposed skin. "Altitude 19,300 feet, and dropping fast, Mac," Harris shouted over the deafening mechanical noise. The Valkyrie was listing heavily to the right, compensating for the runaway drag on the starboard wing. The B-17 was designed to be robust, but it was not designed to endure a localized mechanical earthquake for long periods. Every rivet was under strain. Mac reached the area behind the main wing spar. This was the junction point. Below him was the infamous catwalk, a narrow structural tunnel that ran through the wing's leading edge and provided access to the engine nacelles for ground crew. In flight, utilizing this catwalk was considered suicidal. It was unpressurized, brutally cold, and the slipstream hitting the access ports created a wind force capable of ripping a man's body from its anchor points. But the real threat wasn't the wind or the cold. It was the location of the propeller governor mechanism. This device, usually responsible for controlling the pitch and feathering, was housed deep within the engine housing. To fix the linkage, Mac needed to manually apply a brake to the propeller shaft itself, a procedure that required the kind of access available only to a maintenance crew standing on a scaffold. Mac grabbed a thick maintenance line, a safety rope he'd previously installed himself, against regulations, specifically for catastrophic repairs. He secured one end to a heavy strut behind the spar. "I'm going into the access tunnel for engine 3. Give me an altitude check every 30 seconds, Mac instructed Harris. "Understood, Mac." Be careful, man. That engine is asterisk, screaming asterisk. Mac clipped the safety line to his belt and pulled open the heavy circular inspection port that led into the wing root. The sound instantly tripled in volume, transforming into a physical blow. The rush of air inside the tunnel was a 200 mph vacuum cleaner, capable of pulling the helmet straight off his head. The catwalk was perhaps 18 inches wide. It was dark, slick with condensation, and Mac could feel the vibration of the damaged engine running through the metal floor directly into his bones. He crawled, using the access handles bolted to the roof of the tunnel for purchase, moving toward the roaring engine. After crawling 5 feet, he reached the accessory section door. This was the point of no return. The door itself was vibrating so badly that the locking mechanism was jumping. Mac had to hammer a wrench into the frame to wedge it open, a loud metallic clang that seemed to be swallowed instantly by the jet stream noise. Inside the nacelle was the heart of the problem. Oil was spraying lightly, freezing almost instantly onto the manifold. The propeller shaft was visible, spinning at thousands of RPMs, disconnected from the power, but still carrying massive kinetic energy. The governor linkage was clearly shattered, a mess of broken steel cable and fluid. Mac realized the standard fix was impossible. He couldn't repair the linkage in this environment. He had to stop the rotational force. He pulled the cargo chain from his belt. His plan, insane and technically brilliant, was to introduce a non-metallic resistance, a foreign object strong enough to slow, but not instantaneously snap, the spinning shaft, acting as an improvised brake pad against the accessory case housing. He would have to manually feed the heavy chain, designed for securing oxygen tanks, into the rapidly spinning accessory gearbox, fouling the mechanism just enough to slow the runaway prop until the friction consumed the chain and hopefully seized the shaft asterisk, without asterisk causing the engine to explode. He raised the chain, the freezing metal slick in his hand. At that exact moment, the waist gunner, Technical Sergeant Miller, screamed over the intercom. "Fighters! 2 Focke-Wulfs at 6 o'clock high. They're peeling off, coming right for us." The first element of the German defense had found the crippled, isolated flying fortress. McDowell was trapped in the catwalk, half exposed to the wind, holding a piece of chain, attempting a repair that would either save the plane or trigger a catastrophic fiery engine collapse. The Focke-Wulf 190s, the butchers of the Luftwaffe, were deadly short-range fighters, fast and heavily armed. Lieutenant Vance knew their standard tactic: target the stragglers, especially those trailing smoke or vibrating violently. Asterisk, the Valkyrie asterisk, was now a sitting duck, 18,900 feet in the air, falling out of the protective canopy of the main bomber stream. Nose gunner, try to scare them off. Waist gunners, hold your fire until they commit. Focus on keeping the wings level. Vance commanded, his voice tight but controlled. Meanwhile, Mac was in the throat of the beast. He was peering into the engine nacelle, his face less than a foot from the spinning metal. He ignored the chatter on the intercom. The enemy was irrelevant if the engine tore itself off first. The sound inside the catwalk, amplified by the resonant metal structure, was overwhelming. Mac had to perform this delicate, yet brutally forceful, task-blind, guided only by the feel of the vibrations and the sight of the flashing oil. He knew that if he threw the chain at the shaft, the immediate shock could shear the entire accessory housing. He had to introduce the friction gradually, feeding the heavy links into the whirling machinery. This improvisation required a level of intimacy with the engine that went beyond any maintenance manual. He had to understand where the force would dissipate. At 1:41 p.m., Mac extended his arm into the frigid, oil-slicked abyss of the nacelle. He held the chain taut. The first link touched the spinning casing. The vibration momentarily intensified, sending a high-frequency shockwave through Mac's arm and shoulder. He gritted his teeth, resisting the urge to pull back. He forced the chain deeper, allowing a small section, perhaps 6 inches, to snake down and begin to wrap around the accessory shaft. The sound immediately changed. The horrific metallic shriek was replaced by a massive grinding roar, like 1,000 gears stripping simultaneously. Sparks flew, instantly extinguished by the slipstream. The B-17 lurched violently. This was not the torque of the engine. This was the reaction of the machine to the foreign object. "Mac, what the hell was that sound?" Vance yelled, his professionalism briefly dissolving into terror. "It's the fix, Lieutenant. Hold steady." Mac replied, though his voice was barely a rasp. The chain was now biting, fouling the mechanism, converting the rotational energy into friction and heat. The rapid deceleration was tearing the chain apart. Mac watched as links snapped under the immense pressure, the fragments being thrown out into the nacelle housing. The smell of burning metal and rubber filled the catwalk. For 5 agonizing seconds, the bomber bucked and shook, worse than before. Then, suddenly, the grinding stopped. The shaking eased. The engine number 3 propeller blades stuttered, slowed, and then stopped completely, frozen in a non-feathered, high-drag position. The chain had done its job. It seized the shaft. The instant calm was profound, almost deafening compared to the preceding noise. "Propeller stopped, sir. Engine 3 is frozen. Drag is enormous, but the vibration is gone," Mac reported, pulling his hand back, the raw skin freezing in the cold air, burned by the friction. Before Vance could respond, the world outside exploded. The Focke-Wulfs had timed their attack perfectly, while Mac was preoccupied. The first burst of 20mm cannon fire hammered into Asterisk, the Valkyrie Asterisk's tail section. Tracer rounds sliced through the aluminum skin, shredding the elevator controls and spraying shrapnel through the fuselage. "Tail gunner is down. We're hit hard." Miller screamed from the waist. Vance, fighting the controls, realized the secondary problem. While Mac had stopped the vibration, the frozen prop, not fully feathered, created massive asymmetrical drag. They were still falling, now at 1,000 feet per minute, and the Focke-Wulfs were lining up for their second pass, targeting the undamaged Engine 4. Mac, still in the wing route, realized the bomber was banking uncontrollably. He had stopped the mechanical enemy, only to deliver Asterisk, the Valkyrie Asterisk, and its crew into the hands of the human enemy. He couldn't return to the main cabin yet. The drag needed to be corrected, or they would crash regardless of the fighter threat. He needed to feather the stopped prop manually, a task requiring access to the front of the nacelle. He needed to get out of the catwalk and onto the exterior wing surface, 18,500 feet over Germany, while under fire. This was no longer a repair. This was a suicide mission for one man. At 1:43 p.m., the second Focke-Wulf attack run commenced. The German pilot was experienced, firing a devastating volley that targeted the nose and the cockpit area. Metal shrieked as rounds punched through the heavy glass, narrowly missing Lieutenant Vance, but shattering the instrument panel. Damage to the hydraulics. "We're losing control stability," Vance shouted. Asterisk, the Valkyrie Asterisk, was now a damaged glider, plummeting toward the Earth at a desperate angle, its 2 remaining engines, number 1 and 2, straining to compensate for the massive, uneven drag of the frozen propeller on number 3. McDowell was still wedged in the wing root, grappling with the inspection hatch. He had to get to the external cowl flaps, the mechanism that controlled the engine's external cooling, and could, if handled correctly, provide just enough leverage to manually shift the non-feathered propeller blades into a more streamlined, lower drag angle. He clipped the thick safety line back to the main strut, giving himself about 4 feet of play. He pulled open the small external access door, normally used only for ground maintenance. The air that rushed in was not a wind. It was a pressurized, freezing fist traveling at 180 miles per hour. It slammed Mac against the internal rib of the wing structure. He pushed his body half out of the opening. Below him, 18,000 feet of open air blurred past. The German countryside was dangerously close. He had perhaps 5 minutes before they fell into the effective range of light flak guns, which were far more numerous than the heavy batteries. Mac had to crawl onto the leading edge of the wing. It was only 3 feet wide at this point, slick with a fine layer of frozen oil and condensation. His safety line was anchored deep inside the fuselage, but a single slip meant the line would instantly go taut and snap his spine before he swung helplessly beneath the plane. He exited the wing route, placing his boots on the rivet heads. The freezing wind immediately began to numb his face and hands. He moved slowly, deliberately, focusing entirely on the movement of the aircraft. He was acutely aware of the risk. The B-17 was vibrating from the twin engines fighting the drag, creating tiny, unpredictable shifts in traction. He reached the housing of engine number 3. The propeller blades, thick and black, were immobile, positioned at a near perpendicular angle to the direction of flight. The drag was immense. The engine was effectively acting as a giant air brake on the right side. Mac found the manual lever for the cowl flap's heavy metal vanes designed to control airflow over the engine cylinders. He grabbed the lever, his fingers already stiffening from the cold, and pulled. Nothing happened. The lever was seized, likely frozen by the intense low temperature and the recent metallic violence. He pulled again, using all his body weight and leverage, bracing himself against the smooth, curved metal of the nacelle. He needed to angle the cowl flap's asterisk against asterisk the slipstream to create a slight, asymmetrical lift on the engine housing, hoping the pressure wave would gently nudge the non-feathered blades. He pulled so hard he heard the fabric of his flight suit rip. With a deafening squeal of grinding metal, the cowl flap lever finally broke loose, giving way an inch. Just as Mac achieved the necessary leverage, the remaining Focke-Wulf, having made a wide turn, attacked again. This time, the bullets weren't aimed at the tail or the cockpit. They were aimed directly at the massive, inviting target of the disabled engine number 3. The 20mm cannon shells stitched a line across the wing, passing barely 3 feet above Mac's head. The deafening asterisk, thump, thump, thump asterisk of the cannon fire was followed by the sound of tearing aluminum and a scent of aviation fuel. The shells missed the main fuel bladder in the wing, but they severely damaged the leading edge, turning the sleek structure into a rough, jagged mess. The damage created instant, chaotic turbulence directly around Mac. The force of the sudden turbulence slapped Mac against the wing's surface like a discarded rag doll. His safety line went taut, jarring his shoulder with brutal force. His improvised fix, the cowl flap leverage, was momentarily lost. The crippled B-17 was falling below 18,000 feet. The pilot was fighting the controls, but the damage was compounding. "Mac, are you still out there? We need those props streamlined. We're going to stall." Vance shouted, the urgency overriding the static. Mac didn't answer. His oxygen mask had been ripped away by the turbulence. He was breathing the thin air directly, his lungs immediately burning. He was momentarily stunned, clinging desperately to the ruined metal of the nacelle. The cold was turning his hands into useless blocks of ice. The enemy fighter was turning for a fourth and final pass. Mac had to complete the feathering modification asterisk, now asterisk, before hypoxia incapacitated him and the fighter finished the job. He had to trust that his initial fix, the seizure of the prop, had not fatally compromised the mounting. He had to get the blades to move. He had to cheat the laws of aerodynamics using brute force and an improvised lever system on a ruined engine, 3.4 miles above the ground. If you want to see how this decision to climb out onto a damaged wing under fire changed the fate of the Valkyrie crew, smash that like button. It helps YouTube push these forgotten stories to people who've never heard them. Make sure you're subscribed, because the next story might change how you see the entire war. Back to McDowell and the 20,000-foot tightrope. The fourth pass from the Focke-Wulfs 190 was agonizingly precise. The German pilot, realizing the bomber's main defense was crippled, aimed to rake the fuselage from nose to tail. The Valkyrie vibrated with fresh damage. Inside the fuselage, the waist gunners were firing desperately, their twin 50 caliber machine guns spitting white-hot lead, but the fast, armored fighter was too elusive. Mac, clinging to the wing at 17,900 feet, was suffering the first, debilitating effects of acute hypoxia. His vision was blurring at the edges, and the pain in his hands from the cold had dulled into a detached numbness. But Mac understood mechanics, and he understood the clock. He had seconds. He needed to apply sustained rotational pressure to the large aluminum ring that housed the cowl flaps, using the seized lever as a fulcrum. The idea was simple yet demanded suicidal precision. Use the force of the air, striking the opened cowl flaps, to slightly rotate the entire engine assembly within its mounting, forcing a small shift in the pitch of the frozen blades relative to the airstream. It was an engineering hack that violated every principle of structural integrity. Mac braced his feet against the jagged hole left by the 20mm shell. He used his remaining strength to pull the lever again, locking it open. The wind immediately hit the displaced flap, creating a severe and localized turbulence vortex. The bomber, already struggling, felt the microshift in drag and tilted even harder to the right. Control. We're entering a 45-degree bank. I'm out of trim. Vance shouted, his voice cracking, fighting a losing battle against the rudder controls, which were sluggish due to the tail damage. Mac ignored the cries from the cockpit. He was operating in a singular focused tunnel. He needed to hold the lever. He wrapped his arm around the base of the nacelle and used his weight to keep the flap open, allowing the air pressure to build. For 10 seconds in eternity at 180 miles per hour, Mac held the position. The engine cowling groaned beneath him, the aluminum protesting the unnatural strain. He was essentially using the air itself as a lever to torque the engine mounting. Then, with a metallic screech that was barely audible over the wind, the frozen prop blades moved a fraction of an inch. Not fully feathered, but enough. They shifted from near perpendicular to perhaps a 45-degree angle. The immediate reduction in drag was startling. The violent, downward list of asterisk. The Valkyrie asterisk eased. The plane stopped plunging. Vance felt the change instantly. Control. I'm getting response. The drag is reducing. Mac, what did you do? Improvised feathering, Lieutenant. Hold your altitude. We need to get out of range. Mac gasped, his lungs burning, his voice hoarse from the wind. He began the arduous task of crawling back into the wing root, moving with the heavy, uncoordinated motions of a man in the grip of high-altitude sickness. Just as his boots found purchase inside the safety of the catwalk entrance, the Focke-Wulfs pilot made a final desperate strafing run. The fighter pilot, seeing the propeller finally stopped and the plane stabilizing, knew the moment was now or never. He aimed for the center wing section, hoping to hit the main fuel tanks. The bullets stitched the fuselage immediately above the catwalk. A round punched through the side, narrowly missing Mac's head, and impacted the opposite side of the internal wing spar. The hit wasn't fatal to the plane, but it tore a jagged 2-foot-long hole in the thin aluminum skin of the fuselage, just 6 inches from where Mac was trying to secure the access hatch. A new enemy arrived: decompression. The air pressure in the radio compartment was compromised. Mac scrambled back inside, slamming the external door shut and sealing the catwalk entrance. He looked down and saw a crimson smear on the metal floor shrapnel from the last pass had ripped a shallow, but bleeding, wound across his hip. It was secondary to the new issue. Lieutenant, we've got a major breach in the radio compartment. Pressure is dropping too fast. Mac shouted, pulling his oxygen mask over his face and slamming his hand over the shrapnel hole on the fuselage wall, trying to act as a hewing patch. Altitude, 17,200 feet. The B-17 was no longer falling, but was maintaining a steady, albeit low, glide speed, heading east away from the Luna target zone, but deeper into occupied territory. They had survived the fighter attack and the engine failure, but now they were breathing vacuum, and they were alone. Mac needed to make a permanent patch, and he needed materials. He looked around the damaged radio compartment. His eyes fell on the very equipment Sergeant Harris was using, the radio itself. The heavy components, the copper coils, the metal housing, it was the only substantial metal available. To save the crew from hypoxia, Mac would have to cannibalize the only means they had of contacting base, risking being stranded over hostile territory without a distress signal. At 1:49 p.m., the air inside the Valkyrie was getting dangerously thin. The hole ripped by the Focke-Wulfs shell in the radio compartment was acting like a giant pressurized drain. While the crew was on oxygen, the sudden and drastic drop in cabin pressure was causing extreme discomfort, increasing the risk of mechanical failure from temperature shock, and ensuring any subsequent injury would be magnified. Sergeant Harris was trying to use the radio Abalki, heavy minus 287 Seychelles rupees, but the power was flickering, a side effect of the shrapnel hits to the secondary wiring harness. He looked over at Mac, who was bleeding and struggling to keep his hand over the breach. "Mac, we're going to pass out. The pressure gauge is almost maxed out on the low side." Harris exclaimed, watching the needle plunge. "I know. Give me your emergency toolkit, Dale, and get ready to pull out every component you don't absolutely need to breathe," Mac ordered. Mac's decision was immediate and absolute, sacrificing communication for survival. The radio itself was a dense piece of metal engineering. Mac ripped apart the chassis of the auxiliary power unit and the heavy casing of the radio transmitter. He needed solid, flat pieces of metal structural plates to seal the gaping hole in the fuselage. Working with frantic speed, Mac used a heavy-duty crimping tool and his emergency wrench to brutally detach the metal panels from the radio set. He wasn't dismantling. He was dissecting with violence. The radio operator watched, horrified but compliant, as Mac sacrificed their only link to the 8th Air Force Command in England. Mac flattened the thick metal plates as best he could, using the base of his boots and the heavy structural rib of the wing spar as an anvil. "Harris, I need you to soak every piece of available cloth, rag, or padding you can find in oil. Engine oil, hydraulic fluid, whatever is nearby," Mac instructed. Harris, understanding the principle of the fix, immediately went to work, fetching heavy insulation blankets and soaking them with the sticky, cold fluid from a breached oil line near the catwalk. Mac began the process of welding the patch using extreme cold and pressure. He placed the heavy, oil-soaked fabric over the jagged hole. Then he placed the flat, cold metal plates from the radio on top of the fabric. He then began to hammer the patch into place. He didn't have a heavy mallet, so he used the largest piece of hardware available, a spare oxygen tank cylinder, using the rounded end as a makeshift hammer. Asterisk clang, clang, clang. The sound was immense in the thin air, the force jarring the entire structure. Mac was driving the metal patch into the fuselage wall, using the surrounding metal as a locking mechanism. The oil-soaked fabric served two purposes. It filled the gaps, and in the sub-zero temperatures, the oily residue began to flash freeze, creating a rigid, almost airtight seal around the edges. It took 4 minutes of brutal hammering. At 1:53 p.m., the pressure gauge registered a slow, agonizing climb in cabin pressure. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to stave off the worst effects of hypoxia. "Lieutenant, pressure stabilized. Not perfect, but sustainable. We are deaf, dumb, and blind on communication, but we are breathing," Mac reported, his voice raspy. "Understood, Mac. You are a miracle worker. Now we need a miracle in navigation. We are running on 2 engines, severely damaged, deep over hostile territory. Our rendezvous with the fighter escort was timed for T plus 40 minutes. That time has passed. We are alone. Vance now faced his own critical dilemma. The primary mission bombing the Luna synthetic fuel plant was aborted. The secondary mission was survival. They had to choose a direction. Option A: head back west toward the North Sea and the established friendly air corridors. This was the long route, requiring them to cross hundreds of miles of German defenses and potentially encounter fresh fighter waves. With the tail damaged and 2 working engines, they might not make it. Option B: fly south, heading for Switzerland. Neutral territory offered sanctuary and immediate care, but it meant flying over the heart of Bavaria and the heavily defended Alpine passes, a route they hadn't briefed for. Vance checked his maps, his eyes scanning the impossible geometry of risk. They were currently flying slightly east of Leipzig, 450 miles from the North Sea and 300 miles from the Swiss border. The decision was made not by the pilot, but by the relentless mathematics of fuel consumption. With the drag created by the partially feathered prop on engine 3, their fuel economy was drastically reduced. The long route was impossible. Mac, prepare the crew. We are diverting south. We are going for Switzerland. We'll be flying low and fast. This changes everything, Vance announced. Flying low meant abandoning the relative safety of high altitude and diving straight into the light flak and small arms fire. It also meant a crucial mechanical adaptation. The remaining engines would have to run hot and hard for a long, continuous duration, far exceeding their normal operational limits. Mac wiped the blood from his hip. Understood, Lieutenant. Tell the gunners to reload everything. If we go low, we're going to be fighting infantry. He then looked at the mangled wreckage of the radio. He still had the copper wiring and a small functional solenoid from the radio's antenna tuning unit. An idea, cold and brilliant, formed in his mind. If they were going low, they needed more than just speed. They needed a distraction, an engineering feint to survive the next 300 miles. At 2:05 p.m., the Valkyrie began its rapid descent from 17,000 feet. The plan was terrifyingly simple. Skim the terrain, relying on the speed of the 2 remaining engines and the cover of local geography to avoid detection by major radar installations. The target altitude was 500 feet, which meant flying beneath the cloud cover and directly over farms, forests, and German supply lines. The shift in environment was immediate. The sky was no longer a frozen vacuum, but a hazy, turbulent mass. The air grew thicker, heavier, and warmer, allowing the crew to briefly remove their oxygen masks. However, the warmth presented a new mechanical problem. The 2 overworked engines, number 1 and number 2, were rapidly overheating. Engine tongue are spiking, Mac. We're redlining. If we keep this up, we'll lose another engine in 30 minutes. Vance reported with alarm. Standard procedure required throttling back and climbing to cooler altitudes, but that was impossible. They were committed to the low-altitude dash. Mac, having secured the pressure patch, was now in the bomb bay, inspecting the remaining unarmed munitions they were bringing back. He carried the solenoid and copper wiring salvaged from the destroyed radio. Lieutenant, we need to divert heat, but we can't slow down. We need to create maximum turbulent airflow around the remaining nacelles. I'm going to attempt an external cooling fix, Mac said. Mac's improvised solution centered on the B-17 as only remaining offensive payload, the AIM 6 500-pound bombs. While they were unarmed, safety pins still in place, they were scheduled to be dropped only over the target. Mac saw them as structural components for a temporary solution. He instructed the bombardier, Lieutenant Hayes, to partially drop the remaining bombs, not releasing them completely, but lowering them onto the external shackles using a manual override switch, exposing them to the slipstream. The bomb bay doors opened with a squeal, exposing the crew to the 500-foot drop below. Mac began working on the undercarriage, using the heavy copper wires and the solenoid to create a crude secondary power circuit. His goal was to temporarily jam open the engine cowling flaps on the working engines, forcing them to overcool and thus reducing the chance of thermal runaway. However, jamming them permanently would create too much drag. He needed intermittent, controlled cooling bursts. Using the electrical components from the radio, Mac jury-rigged a momentary switch, connecting the solenoid to the emergency hydraulic line that controlled the cooling flaps. He then routed a manual pull wire from the solenoid back into the radio compartment. "Lieutenant, I've wired the cowl flaps on 1 and 2 to a manual control point. I can't automate it, but I can pull them open and closed on command. We can pulse the cooling, but only for 5 seconds at a time. It's a precision fix." "You fly, I cool," Mac explained. This required Mac to manually monitor the temperature gauge from the radio compartment and physically pull the wire every time the needle approached. The red zone, a dangerous distraction, requiring intense focus. At 2:15 p.m., they passed directly over a small German railway siding. Suddenly, the sky ahead erupted in tracer fire. Not heavy flak, but concentrated small arms fire from ground troops, and perhaps a light 20mm anti-aircraft battery positioned to defend the rail line. "Contact! Ground fire at 11 o'clock low," Vance yelled. The B-17 shuddered as rifle rounds peppered the underside. This was exactly what Mac had anticipated when planning his distraction. He wasn't just fixing the drag. He was preparing a psychological weapon. He still had 3 functioning 500-pound bombs, partially lowered in the bomb bay. He grabbed a handful of emergency smoke flares used for search and rescue. Mac opened a small observation port in the floor. As the ground rushed by at terrifying speed, he began to deploy his deception. He yanked the pins from the smoke flares and tossed them out one by one, timing their release perfectly above small, populated areas. The flares were designed to produce thick, bright orange smoke. As they fell, they created the appearance of multiple large objects dropping from the Valkyrie. The German ground crews, trained to see bomber drops as a sign of imminent threat, reacted exactly as Mac had hoped. They saw the flares and assumed the B-17 was dropping ordnance, not on their position, but on the targets just beyond them. The small arms fire around the Valkyrie momentarily ceased as the ground troops and the light anti-aircraft battery ducked for cover, expecting the blast wave. It was a brilliant psychological feint, buying them 30 critical seconds of peace to clear the immediate combat zone. The fire stopped. They thought we were bombing them. Vance laughed, a sound of pure adrenaline. "It won't work twice, Lieutenant, but we've cleared the rail line. Now, keep the altitude steady. Temperature is spiking cooling pulse now," Mac commanded, pulling the wire that momentarily opened the engine cowlings, flooding the nacelles with cooling air. The Valkyrie running on 2 carefully managed engines and a wing patched by sheer will, plunged onward toward the distant neutral border, a wounded ghost in the German sky. But the closer they got to the heart of Bavaria, the thicker the high-speed air traffic became. They were flying toward the biggest concentration of fighter airfields in the Reich. By 2:45 p.m., the landscape below had shifted dramatically, marked by the rolling hills and dense forests of southern Germany. The B-17 was flying so low now, averaging 400 feet above the tree line, that the crew could clearly see vehicles on the Autobahn. The noise of the engines was deafening inside the thin aluminum shell, echoing the rising tension. Mac was locked into a monotonous, critical rhythm. Monitor engine temperature, pull the cooling wire, release, repeat. Each pulse of cooling air momentarily increased drag, threatening to stall the already struggling aircraft. His precision kept the engines from failing, but the continuous stress was wearing him down. Lieutenant Vance was using every terrain feature available, following the curves of rivers and hiding asterisk. The Valkyrie asterisk in the shadow of steep ridges to break the line of sight from potential forward observation posts. The main threat was now patrol aircraft. While the Focke-Wulfs were deadly, the twin-engine Messerschmitt Me 410 Hornet heavy fighters, designed for bomber interception and recon, posed a different, perhaps greater, risk. They carried heavy armor and a devastating battery of guns and rockets. At 2:51 p.m., the lookout, Sergeant Dale Harris, spotted trouble. Aircraft at 2 o'clock high. It's a 410. They saw us. They're dropping altitude. The Me 410 was descending rapidly, a lethal predator spotting wounded prey. It was faster than the crippled B-17, even with its two powerful engines. Vance banked hard, wrenching the heavy bomber into a turn that was far too tight for their speed, trying to dive into the protection of a deep forested valley. "Gunners, brace for a head-on pass." "Everything you have," Vance roared. The Me 410, flying with grim German efficiency, didn't bother with a long chase. It deployed its heavy, forward-firing 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns in a sweeping attack designed to cut the Valkyrie in half. The fight was brutal and brief. The Me 410's cannon fire tore through the fuselage. The heavy armor plating of the B-17 saved the life of the cockpit crew, but the sheer force of the impact shook the remaining working engines violently. Mac felt the impact like a giant hammer blow against the plane. In the radio compartment, sparks flew from damaged wiring, and the makeshift pressure patch he'd hammered into the fuselage buckled slightly. Engine 1 sputtering, fuel pressure dropping. Vance shouted. The attack had compromised engine number 1's fuel line, and the high-speed run was now critically endangered. With the enormous drag on the dead number 3, losing engine 1 meant they would not have enough power to maintain flight speed, leading to an inevitable crash. Mac knew he couldn't leave the main cabin. The remaining engine was too far, and the time too short. He had to fix the fuel feed issue from inside the cabin, relying on whatever was accessible. He scrambled into the co-pilot's position, ripping away the floor plates beneath the main instrument console. The fuel lines were encased in thick metal sheaths, but the Messerschmitt's fire had managed to pierce the protective housing. Fuel was leaking, not gushing, but enough to starve the engine in minutes. The problem was that the leak was a hairline fracture in a high-pressure line, inaccessible without shutting down the engine, which would seal their doom. Mac saw a tiny wisp of fuel misting from the line, creating a dangerously flammable vapor inside the cockpit. He looked around desperately for something that could withstand the pressure and the heat, something malleable yet strong enough to temporarily plug the microscopic hole. He remembered a briefing from his unit commander, detailing an absurd, almost apocryphal wartime fix, using chewing gum to seal small fuel leaks in P-51s. Mac quickly ripped off his oxygen mask, grabbed the pack of Wrigley's spearmint gum that the navigator, Lieutenant Evans, kept for altitude sickness, and tore the wax paper away. He crammed 4 sticks into his mouth, chewing furiously for a few seconds until the gum became a soft, resilient polymer mass. He had to work fast. The flavor oils in the gum would dissolve quickly under the pressure and heat of the fuel line, but the rubbery base might hold for a crucial few minutes. He reached down into the tight space, ignoring the sharp, oily edges of the broken metal, and pressed the wad of spearmint gum firmly over the hairline fracture in the high-pressure fuel line. The fuel pressure, which was approximately 35 psi, immediately tested the sealant. A small bubble of fuel pushed through the gum, but the mass held. Fuel pressure stabilizing on engine 1. "It's holding, Lieutenant. I used gum. For God's sake, don't sneeze, Mac reported. Vance, who had just managed to shake the pursuing Me-410 by flying directly through a massive flock of frightened birds, looked over, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and relief. Gum, Mac? You saved a B-17 with spearmint gum? It's a temporary patch. We have 30 minutes, maybe less, before it dissolves. We need to be over Switzerland by 3:30 p.m., or we crash. The Me-410 had broken off the attack, but the encounter had cost them precious fuel and time. They were now flying on a prayer and chewing gum, heading directly toward the heavily defended southern German border, the final gauntlet before freedom. The time was 3:18 p.m. The Swiss border was less than 30 miles away, but the final approach was proving the most dangerous. They were flying low, between 200 and 300 feet, over the heavily militarized perimeter near Lake Constance. The chewing gum on Engine 1's fuel line was beginning to degrade. Mac could smell the strong, sweet scent of spearmint mixing with the smell of gasoline. The fuel pressure gauge was fluctuating wildly, oscillating between 28 and 35 psi, a clear warning that the engine was on the verge of starving again. We're losing Engine 1, Mac. It's going to seize. We need full power now. Vance yelled, gripping the controls. I know, Lieutenant. But if we push it too hard, the gun will blow out completely. And Engine 2 is running too hot from the sustained high power. Mac realized he had maximized every temporary fix. There was no more metal to cannibalize, no more patches to apply. Their survival now depended entirely on crossing the invisible line before the fragile mechanical system gave way. Vance made the final, calculated gamble. He ordered the remaining gunners to jettison all excess weight ammunition, empty oxygen bottles, anything not strictly essential. The crew complied instantly, tossing hundreds of pounds of gear out of the waste hatches. The B-17, lighter but still crippled by the drag of the frozen prop, responded with a small but vital increase in speed. At 3:24 p.m., the ground defenses saw them. A battery of 488mm anti-aircraft guns, positioned near a small forward airfield, opened fire. They were firing at a shallow angle, creating a wall of black smoke and shrapnel directly ahead of Asterisk, the Valkyrie Asterisk. Vance had to perform an impossible maneuver, a low-altitude weave through the blossoming, deadly flak. Hold on. Weave left, then hard right, Vance shouted. The B-17 banked violently. Mac braced himself, his eyes locked on the temperature gauge for Engine 2. The gauge was deep into the red zone. If he didn't pulse the cooling, they would lose the engine. If he did, the resulting increase in drag might stall the plane mid-weave, guaranteeing they were caught in the flak burst. This was the final dilemma. Mac had to choose between immediate stall risk or guaranteed overheating failure. He made the counterintuitive choice. He pulled the cooling wire, holding the cowl flaps open for a crucial 8 seconds, well past the safe margin, forcing a massive, immediate airflow. The plane shuddered, fighting the drag. Vance roared, fighting the sudden instability. But the desperate cooling pulse worked. The temperature gauge for Engine 2 dropped 3 degrees, pulling it back from the brink of failure. They were now in the heart of the flak zone. Shell fragments ripped into the underside of the bomber. The cockpit was vibrating so violently, it felt like the control column might snap off in Vance's hands. Navigator, distance to border. Vance demanded. 3 miles. Repeat, 3 miles. Evans screamed back. The spearmint gum patch blew. At 3:27 p.m., a fine mist of gasoline erupted from the fuel line fracture in Engine 1. The gauge immediately began to drop toward zero. Engine 1 failure confirmed. I repeat, Engine 1 is dead, Mac yelled. Asterisk, the Valkyrie Asterisk, was now running on a single engine, Engine 2, fighting the colossal drag of 2 dead props on the starboard wing. The B-17 immediately began to dive and roll toward the right, uncontrollable. Feather number 1. "Get that prop off the wind," Vance commanded. "No hydraulic pressure to the feathering pump, sir. The prop is windmilling and adding drag," Mac replied. The situation was terminal. They were 120 seconds from the Swiss border, flying with a single functioning engine and fighting the drag of 2 catastrophic mechanical failures. The plane was falling out of the sky. Mac knew what he had to do. He climbed over the control panel, wrench in hand, and moved toward the nose. He looked at the vast array of avionics, the non-essential components that still added weight. He found the single most dense, heavy, and non-essential piece of equipment in the nose, the heavy steel housing of the camera used to photograph bomb damage assessment. "Lieutenant, I'm jettisoning the BDA camera. It's 150 pounds of dead weight. I need to shift the center of gravity to the port side," Mac announced. Mac used the wrench to smash the mounting bolts of the heavy camera housing, tearing it free from its anchors. The co-pilot helped him push the massive piece of steel toward the edge of the cockpit and out through the shattered nose window. The instant the 150-pound weight left the B-17, the effect was profound. The shift in the center of gravity, coupled with the jettisoning of other excess weight, provided the slightest, most marginal lift on the port wing. The massive, uncontrollable roll eased. The single engine had just *enough power to stabilize the plane. At 3:29 p.m., skimming the rooftops of a small German village, the Valkyrie lurched across the invisible line. They were in Swiss airspace. The German 88mm crews, bound by the strict laws of neutrality, ceased fire instantly. The B-17, a battered wreck held together by patches, grit, and spearmint gum, stumbled onto the ground of a neutral airfield near Dubendorf, Switzerland, 400 miles from its intended destination. At 3:35 p.m. on June 20th, 1944, the Valkyrie slid onto the wet grass runway of the Swiss airfield, the single remaining engine sputtering and dying from fuel starvation moments after touchdown. Swiss military personnel, dressed in crisp neutral uniforms, rushed toward the bomber. The airframe was covered in bullet holes, its tail chewed up, one wing looking permanently deformed, and the spearmint residue from Mac's final patch dissolving rapidly in the warm engine housing. The crew of 10 men, exhausted and suffering from exposure and minor wounds, staggered out of the bomber. Lieutenant Vance immediately grabbed Sergeant Maynard McDowell, the chief engineer, by the arm. "Mac, you didn't just save the plane. You fundamentally changed the definition of what a B-17 could endure," Vance said, his voice thick with emotion. The Swiss interned the crew and the aircraft for the duration of the war. The Valkyrie was immediately a source of intense technical study for the Swiss engineers. They documented Mac's array of field modifications, the chain-welded propeller seizure, the manually controlled cooling flaps, powered by a radio solenoid, and the crude but functional pressure patch. The story of the spearmint gum, used to save Engine 1, became an instant legend among the Allied airmen interned in Switzerland. The engineering improvisations of Mac McDowell demonstrated a principle rarely acknowledged in high command. Sometimes, the greatest tactical advantage comes not from superior equipment, but from the unauthorized, desperate genius of men facing impossible odds. After the war, Mac McDowell returned to Detroit, where he opened a highly successful custom machine shop, reportedly never looking at a piece of Wrigley's spearmint gum the same way again. The 9 lives he saved that day, including his own, were a testament to the fact that the most valuable asset in the war wasn't steel or fuel, but human ingenuity under pressure. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We publish new untold World War II stories every day, and you won't want to miss them. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you in the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, or somewhere else, our community stretches across the world. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Did any of your relatives serve in World War II, especially in the European theater of operations? Tell us in the comments. Sergeant Maynard McDowell and the crew of the Valkyrie deserve to be remembered. These men sacrificed everything so future generations could live in freedom. By watching, liking, and sharing these stories, you're helping make that happen. Never forget,